The arrival of the sky was filled with strange lights, but no one on Earth knew what they meant. In the deep quiet of space, 9,900 ships appeared. They weren't friendly. They weren't peaceful. They were the beginning of an invasion, not at first. It was just a few lights, bright and fast, flickering on the edge of Earth's atmosphere. It was easy to ignore at first. Maybe a few people in the military saw them, but no one thought much of it. Not until it was too late. Then, one by one, the ships began to appear in Earth's sky. They didn't land, they just hovered, looming over the planet like giants. And then the alarms went off. Attention! Attention! This is not a drill. The voice of General Roberts echoed over the loudspeakers in the underground military base. He was calm, but there was something in his voice that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. We are under attack. The enemy fleet has arrived. All units prepare for combat. This is no exercise. Across the world, the message was the same. Governments scrambled to respond. The military prepared to defend. But no one was ready for what was coming. The enemy ships were massive. Their shapes were strange and jagged, like nothing Earth had ever seen. They didn't match anything in the records of alien species. They were tall, dark, and seemed to absorb the light around them. As they got closer, they began to drop weapons and strange devices into Earth's atmosphere. Buildings crumbled. Cities went dark. At the United Nations, the world leaders gathered, watching the screens in fear. The only thing they could agree on was the fact that Earth had never been more vulnerable. Who are they? President Carolyn Haas asked, her hands shaking as she stared at the screen. The footage showed a large ship hovering above New York City, an energy beam shooting down from it, destroying the skyline. They're not from any known alliance, one of the generals replied, his voice tight. We've never seen ships like these. Do we have any chance? The president asked, her voice strained. The general shook his head. I'm afraid not. Our forces are being overwhelmed. The enemy is too powerful. Far above, in the darkness of space, the invaders watched Earth carefully. Their fleet stretched across the sky, blocking out the stars. Their ships communicated in a language no one on Earth could understand. But they didn't need to speak the same language. The message was clear. Earth was theirs for the taking. On the ground, chaos erupted. People ran through the streets, confused, scared, and desperate to escape. Military forces tried to fight back, but their weapons were useless. The invader ships were nearly invincible, their shields too strong for Earth's missiles to break. At the same time, in the heart of Earth's last remaining hope, the Defiance, the last warship humanity had, powered up. It had been abandoned for years, its crew long gone. But now, it was the only thing between Earth and total destruction. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the captain's chair, his mind racing. The Defiance wasn't a state-of-the-art warship. It wasn't the most powerful ship humanity had ever built. But it was all that was left. We're the last line of defense, Morrison muttered to himself, his eyes locked on the control panel. We have to make this count. The Defiance's engines roared to life, and it shot out of Earth's atmosphere, heading straight for the enemy fleet. With the ship's systems coming online one by one, Morrison's team of survivors, a small group of military personnel and scientists, prepared for the most important mission humanity had ever faced. As they broke through the atmosphere, the vast Zayler fleet loomed in front of them. The ships stretched across the sky, thousands of them. No human ship had ever seen so many alien vessels in one place. The fleet was a nightmare come to life, an unstoppable force with only one goal, to take Earth. Morrison stood tall, his face set with determination. He knew that this was humanity's last stand. The Defiance wasn't going to win any battles. With its outdated weapons and aging technology, But it was humanity's symbol of resistance, and he wasn't going to let Earth fall without a fight. "Ready the weapons," Morrison said, his voice firm. "We're going to show them that Earth won't go down without a fight." The crew sprang into action, activating the ship's guns and energy shields. The Defiance was smaller, slower, and weaker than the ships surrounding it. But it had one thing the Zayler didn't: the will to fight. Morrison ordered the ship to charge, heading directly for the lead enemy ship. His crew had no idea if they had a chance, but it didn't matter. Earth's survival depended on this moment. As the ship closed the distance, the Zayler fleet took notice, shifting into battle formation. "Fire!" Morrison shouted that the Defiance unleashed everything it had. The blast hit the enemy ship head-on, causing a ripple through its hull. For a moment, it seemed like the impossible had happened. But then the enemy retaliated, firing a massive energy beam that sent the Defiance reeling. The ship shook violently as alarms blared. Morrison gripped the controls, his hands steady despite the danger. "Hold on," he shouted to his crew. "This isn't over." The battle had begun, but humanity's fight for survival was just getting started. And for the first time in years, Earth's fate rested on the shoulders of the few who had dared to hope. The Defiance and its crew weren't going to stop until they had proven that Earth would not be erased from the stars. They had only one chance, and they would make it count. The fate of humanity was on the line, and the universe would soon learn that Earth wasn't so easily defeated. The first strike, the Defiance, shuddered as it fired another volley into the heart of the Zayler fleet. The alien ships, massive and menacing, were everywhere. They blotted out the stars, their dark shapes moving in unison like a swarm of predators. Earth's last warship was outgunned, outnumbered, and desperately fighting. To hold on to its fading hope, Captain Jake Morrison stood at the command station, his fingers dancing over the controls. His eyes never left the view screen, where the Zayler ships hovered, their weapons charging. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Earth's fate was in his hands. He had to make every shot count. "Another hit, Captain," the weapons officer called out. "They're not giving up." Morrison's jaw tightened. The Defiance was taking heavy damage, but it wasn't about to stop. Not yet. The crew aboard this aging ship knew what was at stake. The Defiance was all they had. "Return fire," Morrison ordered, his voice low but fierce. "Every shot counts." The Defiance fired again, its powerful cannons lashing out with force. The blast struck one of the smaller Zayler cruisers, sending it spiraling off course. The crew cheered, but Morrison didn't let himself feel the rush of victory. This was only the beginning. "Their shields are still holding," the tactical officer reported. "We can't break through with our current firepower." Morrison gripped the armrests of his chair, his mind working quickly. They couldn't afford to waste time. They had to do something bold, something unexpected. The Zayler were powerful, but they were predictable. They moved in patterns, and Morrison had seen enough battles to know that sometimes the best strategy wasn't brute force, it was trickery. "Prepare for a flanking maneuver," he ordered, his eyes scanning the enemy fleet. "I want to get us behind them. If we can hit their unprotected flanks, we can break their formation." The crew moved quickly, readying the Defiance for the dangerous maneuver. The ship turned sharply, darting through the enemy fleet's formation, using the chaos of the battle as cover. The Zayler ships fired at them, but they were too slow to react. The Defiance weaved through the deadly barrage, its shields flaring. With each hit, Morrison's heart raced. The maneuver was working. The Defiance was slipping into a gap in the enemy's lines, heading straight for the vulnerable flank. "Target the lead cruiser," Morrison ordered. "All weapons, full power." The Defiance fired with everything it had, the massive cannons, charging up and releasing a devastating blast straight into the heart of the lead Zayler cruiser. The explosion rocked the ship, sending a shockwave through the fleet. For a moment, it seemed like victory was within reach. But then, a wave of enemy reinforcements arrived. "Captain, more ships incoming." The communications officer called. "It's the rest of the Zayler fleet. They've been waiting for us to make a move." Morrison's stomach dropped. The Defiance had made a breakthrough, but now the enemy's full might was coming down on them. Hundreds of ships emerged from the darkness, their weapons charged and ready to obliterate everything in their path. "We've got to get out of here," the tactical officer shouted. "They're overwhelming us." Morrison took a deep breath. There was no retreat. Not now. Not after all they had fought for. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We fight. We hold them off as long as we can." He turned to the communications officer. "Send a distress signal to Earth. Tell them we're holding our ground. Reinforcements are coming, but we need backup now." The officer nodded, sending the message out into the void. They didn't have much time. If Earth couldn't send reinforcements, the Defiance and the crew would be fighting alone. Outside the Defiance, the Zayler fleet advanced, their weapons charging in unison. The Defiance was surrounded, a single ship against an overwhelming enemy. But Captain Morrison didn't flinch. He had seen death before, had faced impossible odds, and he wasn't about to let Earth fall without a fight. "Target their command ship," Morrison barked. "If we take down their leader, it might scatter their forces." The crew worked in unison, their hands flying over the controls as they reoriented the ship toward the heart of the Zayler fleet. The Defiance fired another barrage of energy blasts, this time targeting the lead command ship, a massive vessel that loomed in the center of the enemy formation. "Direct hit," the weapons officer yelled. "It's damaged, but it's still firing." Morrison clenched his fists. The Zayler were relentless. But so was humanity. "Keep firing," Morrison shouted. "We're not backing down." The Defiance continued to fire, its weapons lighting up the void with each blast. For every ship it took down, 10 more appeared in the distance. But Morrison's crew didn't stop. They couldn't. This was Earth's last stand. As the battle raged on, Morrison's mind remained clear. They couldn't win this fight with sheer firepower alone. They needed to outsmart the Zayler, to break their will. And as the Defiance's weapons fired again, another idea sparked in Morrison's mind. They had one final trick up their sleeve, one weapon that might just turn the tide. It was humanity's secret weapon, a technological advantage that the Zayler hadn't counted on, but it was risky. And it might just cost them everything. "Prepare the emergency weapon," Morrison ordered. "If we're going down, we'll go down fighting. And we'll make sure the galaxy knows humanity's name." The crew sprang into action, working quickly to power up the Defiance's last, most powerful weapon. The Zayler might have superior numbers, but humanity had ingenuity. And that was something the invaders couldn't predict. The final strike was coming. And Earth would never be forgotten. A desperate gamble, the Defiance shuddered again, another hit shaking the ship to its core. The alarms blared incessantly as the crew scrambled to keep the systems operational. Captain Jake Morrison gripped the edge of his command chair, his knuckles white from the pressure. They had been holding their own for what felt like hours, but the Zayler fleet was relentless, coming at them from all sides. The numbers were simply too overwhelming. "Captain, shields are down to 30%. We can't take much more of this," the tactical officer yelled. Morrison's gaze was fixed on the main view screen, where the massive Zayler fleet was circling the Defiance. The enemy ships moved in tight formations, prepared to finish the job. They had tried everything surprise. Attacks, feints, and flanking maneuvers, but nothing seemed to slow them down for long. Every time the Defiance struck a blow, the Zayler adapted. "We can't keep playing their game," Morrison muttered to himself. The Defiance was running out of options. If Earth had any hope of surviving, it had to be now. He turned sharply to his crew. We're going to take a risk. We're going to hit them where they least expect it. The crew looked at him, confusion and anxiety written on their faces. This was madness. But Morrison didn't have time to second-guess himself. There was no other choice. If they couldn't break the Zayler's lines, humanity was finished. He turned to the communications officer. Get in touch with Earth. Tell them we need reinforcements, but more importantly, tell them to prepare for the next phase. If we pull this off, it might be the only chance we get. The officer nodded and relayed the message. Captain, the weapons officer said, we're running low on energy. We've used most of our reserves, just holding them off. The main guns are nearly offline. Morrison knew this was the tipping point. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and running out of options. But Earth had one advantage the Zayler didn't. Understand the ability to adapt. And the Defiance was humanity's most adaptable weapon. Prepare the experimental drive, Morrison said, his voice calm but firm. We've only got one shot at this. The crew exchanged nervous glances. The experimental drive was a last-ditch weapon, something humanity had developed in secret before the invasion. It was powerful, yes, but also dangerous. It could warp space, disorient the enemy, and potentially give them the upper hand. But there was no way of knowing for sure if it would work. It was a gamble. Are you sure about this, Captain? The navigation officer asked, eyes wide with disbelief. There's no other choice, Morrison replied. We're going to make them chase us. When they follow, we're going to hit them with everything we've got. The ship's engines whined as they began powering up the experimental drive. It was a new technology, one that would bend space around them, allowing them to move unpredictably. But using it came with risks. The Defiance could end up in an uncharted part of the galaxy, or worse, torn apart by the strain of the technology. It was an untested weapon, and using it could end in disaster. As the energy reserves flared, the crew worked furiously to ensure the drive would engage properly. It was their only chance. Morrison stared at the enemy fleet, now looming closer. They were moments away from launching a final assault. The Defiance would have to move fast for the Zayler to react. Captain, the experimental drive is ready, the officer said, his voice tight. Morrison took a deep breath. Engage the drive, now. The ship shuddered violently, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. Then, the Defiance lurched forward with unimaginable speed. The stars outside the window stretched and twisted as the ship moved through space in ways no ship had ever done before. Time itself seemed to bend and warp as the Defiance vanished from its position and reappeared several kilometers away, right in the midst of the Zayler fleet. The Zayler ships, unprepared for the sudden shift, scrambled to react. But it was too late. The Defiance had already closed the gap. Firing main weapons, the weapons officer shouted. The Defiance's cannons, now fully charged, fired relentlessly into the heart of the closest Zayler flagship. The energy beams hit their target with precision, cutting through shields and causing massive explosions. Direct hit. The officer yelled. Their shields are failing. The enemy fleet was caught off guard. The Defiance had jumped right into their formation, taking them by surprise. But the damage to the Defiance was already significant. The ship's hull groaned under the strain of the drive, and the warning lights flashed as the systems began to fail. Captain, the drive is unstable, the engineering officer cried. We can't maintain this for much longer. It's tearing the ship apart. Keep going, Morrison shouted, refusing to back down. We've got one shot at this. If we can't stop them here, Earth is finished. The Defiance's weapons fired again, destroying 2 more Zayler ships. The invaders, now realizing what had happened, began to regroup. but they were disoriented and struggling to maintain their formation. The unexpected strike had thrown them off balance. The Defiance was small, but it was powerful and humanity's. Last Hope had just delivered a massive blow to the Zayler fleet, but the toll on the ship was immense. The experimental drive had taken too much from the Defiance, and the ship's systems were beginning to fail. The crew worked quickly to keep the ship intact, but it was clear that they couldn't keep this up for long. "Captain, we need to." "Retreat," the communications officer called out. "We can't sustain this much longer. If we don't pull back, we'll be destroyed." Morrison hesitated, but he knew the reality. They had done more damage than anyone had expected, but the Defiance was falling apart. They had to get out now. "Prepare to jump back," Morrison said, his voice steady. "We've done our part. Let's get home." The Defiance's engines fired one last time as it powered away, disappearing back into the depths of space, leaving the Zayler fleet reeling and confused. The battle wasn't over, but humanity had just made a statement. The Zayler might have sent 9,900 ships to Earth, but only 17 would survive the war. The rest would soon follow Dot as the ship entered a new sector. Morrison allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had lived to fight another day. But the war was far from over, and he knew the Zayler would not give up easily. The real fight was just beginning. Tide turns the Defiance drifted in space, its systems strained and battered from the earlier assault. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the helm, staring out into the dark void. His thoughts were a whirlwind, filled with the weight of the recent battle. The Zayler fleet, once confident in its overwhelming numbers, had been dealt a heavy blow, but the fight was far from over. The Defiance had survived, but only just. The enemy would not rest until Earth was wiped from existence. The ship's status reports flooded in, each one a reminder of how close they had come to defeat. Shields were down to 20%. The engines were overheating, and the main weapon systems were offline, but the crew humanity's last hope had survived. They'd pulled off a maneuver that no one thought possible. The Zayler had underestimated them. "Captain," the communications officer said, breaking Morrison's focus, "we've received a transmission from Earth's underground military command. They're ready to send reinforcements." Morrison's eyes flickered to the officer, his heart racing with a mixture of relief and doubt. "Tell them to get ready. We'll need every ship we can get." The Tide turns the Defiance drifted in space, its systems strained and battered from the earlier assault. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the helm, staring out into the dark void. His thoughts were a whirlwind, filled with the weight of the recent battle. The Zayler fleet, once confident in its overwhelming numbers, had been dealt a heavy blow, but the fight was far from over. The Defiance had survived, but only just. The enemy would not rest until Earth was wiped from existence. The ship's status reports flooded in, each one a reminder of how close they had come to defeat. Shields were down to 20%. The engines were overheating, and the main weapon systems were offline. But the crew humanity's last hope had survived. They'd pulled off a maneuver that no one thought possible. The Zayler had underestimated them. "Captain," the communications officer said, breaking Morrison's focus, "we've received a transmission from Earth's underground military command. They're ready to send reinforcements." Morrison's eyes flickered to the officer, his heart racing with a mixture of relief and doubt. "Tell them to get ready. We'll need every ship we can get." The officer nodded, typing furiously at his console. "They're preparing the fleet, but they're still several days out. In the meantime, we're going to have to hold off the Zayler as long as we can." Morrison knew that Earth's forces couldn't afford to wait. If the Zayler regrouped and brought their full might to bear, humanity wouldn't survive the onslaught. He turned to the tactical officer, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We need to strike first. Hit them hard while they're still." recovering. We'll take down their supply ships, their reinforcements, anything we can. Keep them from getting back on their feet." A tactical officer nodded. "Yes, Captain. We've already mapped out their weak spots. It'll be a risk, but we can't afford to waste time." Morrison thought for a moment, running the numbers in his head. They had no choice but to take the risk. The Defiance was one of the last remaining warships, and Earth's military presence was scattered and fragile. But there was something the Zayler hadn't counted on: humanity's ability to adapt, to fight even when the odds were stacked against them. "Prepare the Defiance for another strike," Morrison ordered. "Set course for the Zayler command post. We hit them fast, and we hit them hard." The crew sprang into action. The battle plan was simple: strike deep into the heart of the Zayler fleet and cripple their command structure. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for reinforcements. If they could take out the enemy's leadership, the rest of the fleet would fall into chaos as the ship made its way toward the heart of the Zayler fleet. The atmosphere on board was tense but determined. The crew knew they were fighting for the survival of humanity, and every decision, every action, would determine whether Earth would rise again or be wiped out forever. "Captain, we've entered the Zayler's command zone," the navigation officer reported. "They're heavily fortified. It's going to be tough to break through." "We don't need to break through," Morrison replied, his eyes steely. "We just need to disrupt their command structure. Once we do that, they'll be lost." The Defiance moved swiftly, slipping past the larger Zayler warships and heading straight for the heart of the enemy's defenses. The plan was risky, but it was their best shot. As they closed in on their target, Morrison could feel the weight of the moment. This was a gamble, but it was one they had to take. "Prepare the ion cannon," Morrison ordered. "We'll take down their shields in one shot. Once they're down, we hit them with everything." The ion cannon powered up, its deep hum resonating through the Defiance's metal hull. The crew held their breath as they neared the target, their hearts racing with anticipation. This was it, the moment that could change the course of the sea. "War. Firing ion cannon," the weapons officer called. The blast hit its mark with a deafening roar, sending shockwaves through the Zayler fleet. The enemy's shields flickered and failed, leaving their command ships exposed. The Defiance's guns fired immediately, pounding the unprotected ships with everything they had. The explosions lit up the blackness of space, a dazzling display of firepower. The Zayler fleet, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. But it was too late. The Defiance had already taken out the command center's most vulnerable ships, and the enemy was in disarray. The once proud fleet was faltering, its leadership crippled. "Direct hits on the command ships," the tactical officer reported. "They're losing their coordination. Their ships are falling out of formation." Morrison's eyes flickered with a glimmer of hope. The Zayler fleet was beginning to fracture. But they couldn't stop now. Not when Earth's survival depended on this moment. "Keep the pressure on them," Morrison said, his voice firm. "Don't let up. We can break their will today. This is humanity's chance." The Defiance's weapons fired again, tearing through the disorganized Zayler ships. The Defiance was small, but it was quick, and its crew fought with everything they had. Each shot, each strike was a testament to humanity's resilience. The Zayler had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price. But just as it seemed, the tide was turning. A new signal appeared on the Defiance's radar, another massive wave of Zayler ships, much larger than the first. They had been waiting for this moment, hiding in the shadows, ready to strike. "Captain, we've got more incoming," the communications officer shouted. Morrison's heart sank. The first wave of the battle might be over, but the true fight was just beginning. The Zayler weren't done yet. The reinforcements were arriving, and they were angry. "We've bought ourselves some time," Morrison said, determination filling his voice. "Now we make our stand." The crew, exhausted but resolute, prepared for what was coming next. They had struck the first blow, but the battle for Earth was far from over. They had to hold their ground. They had to make sure that this time the galaxy knew humanity's name Dot as the reinforcements arrived and the Defiance prepared for the next wave. Morrison looked out at the stars. Earth had shown the galaxy that it was not to be underestimated. But the real test was still ahead. The battle for humanity's future was far from over, and the next strike would determine everything. The final counterattack of the Defiance hung in the dark void of space, battered and bruised from the relentless assault. The last battle had left the ship barely holding together, its once powerful hull now riddled with deep scars. The crew was exhausted, but they were not broken. Humanity had fought back, and they had delivered a blow to the Zayler that no one had expected. But now, the real fight was beginning. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, staring out into distance at the approaching Zayler reinforcements. The dark fleet was larger than before, twice the size, perhaps more. Thousands of ships were heading toward Earth's defenses, and the Defiance was running on empty. Captain, we've patched the main systems, but the shields are at 15%. Weapons are at half power, the engineering officer reported, his voice strained. We can't take much more of this. Morrison clenched his jaw, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The Defiance was Earth's last line of defense, and it was all but broken. But Earth had come too far to give up now. They had one final chance to turn the tide. Prepare the fleet, Morrison ordered, turning toward the communications officer. Send a message to Earth's forces. Tell them we're leading the charge. We hold the line here, or we all go down together. The officer nodded, typing swiftly. The message went out, a call to arms to every surviving ship and colony, a signal that humanity wasn't finished. If Earth was going to survive, it would take everything they had. We need a plan, Captain, the tactical officer said, looking at the tactical readouts. The Zayler fleet is too strong. We've already hit them with everything we've got. If we don't change tactics, they'll overwhelm us. Morrison's mind raced. There was no room for hesitation. They had to strike again, but this time it had to be something the Zayler couldn't predict. He turned to the weapons officer. Recalibrate the main cannon, Morrison said, his voice calm, though his mind was working 1,000 miles an hour. I want a concentrated shot, but we'll need to divert power from auxiliary systems. Weapons officer looked uncertain. Captain, that's going to drain us. The power will be nearly gone afterward. I know, Morrison replied. But if we can land a blow deep into their fleet, we might be able to force a retreat. It's a gamble, but it's the only shot we've got. The officer hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Understood, Captain. Recalibrating the main cannon. As the crew worked in a flurry of movement, Morrison stared out the viewing port. His mind kept replaying Earth's last moments. If they failed here, Earth would be just another memory in the galaxy forgotten, erased. The Zayler would conquer everything, and there would be no one left to stand against them. But that wasn't going to happen. Not while Morrison had breath. In his lungs, we've got company, the sensor officer called out. Zayler ships are closing in. They've formed a battle line. The Defiance was outnumbered. The reinforcements had arrived in full force. But Morrison knew this wasn't just about the number of ships. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity would fight until the very end. Activate the emergency drives, Morrison ordered. We're going to get in close, real close. They won't see it coming. The crew worked quickly, adjusting the ship's trajectory. The Defiance sped toward the center of the Zayler formation, moving faster than it should have been able to. It was a dangerous maneuver. If they failed, they would be overwhelmed. But if it worked, Captain, we're on course, the navigation officer said, his voice tense. But we're going to get caught in their fire zone. Just keep us steady, Morrison replied. We get close, fire, and then get the hell out of there. The Defiance closed in on the Zayler fleet, moving through the dark expanse like a needle threading through the eye of a needle. The Zayler, in their arrogance, had expected the Defiance to fight from a distance. But Morrison wasn't going to. Give them the chance to react. Firing in 3, 2, 1. The weapons officer counted down. The main cannon powered up, humming with energy. The air on the bridge grew thick with anticipation. Morrison's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. Fire! Morrison shouted. The cannon discharged with a blinding flash, sending a beam of concentrated energy through the enemy. Fleet! The Zayler ships closest to the blast were torn apart instantly, their shields and hulls disintegrating in a flash of light. The blast struck deep into the heart of their formation, ripping through the center and causing chaos among the two. Alien fleet, direct hit. The weapons officer shouted, his voice filled with awe, but the Defiance was not without its consequences. The ship rocked violently as it expended nearly all its energy in the blast. The lights flickered, and systems began to fail. Captain, we've taken heavy damage, the engineering officer called. We can't hold much longer. Morrison gripped the armrests of his chair, his jaw clenched. The gamble had worked, but they couldn't stay long. The Defiance had delivered a blow, but the Zayler weren't retreating. Not yet. They were regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. Prepare. For immediate retreat, Morrison ordered. We've done what we can. Let's get out of here. The crew scrambled, doing everything they could to keep the ship intact as it began its hasty retreat from the battlefield. The Defiance had done the impossible. It had struck deep into the heart of the Zayler fleet. But even as the ship turned to flee, Morrison knew that this was just the beginning. The Zayler were down, but they were not out. And as the Defiance sped toward Earth's atmosphere, Morrison's thoughts turned to what came next. The war had just taken a new turn. But Earth had sent a clear message. Humanity wasn't going to be wiped out so easily. The final counterattack had worked, but the real fight was still ahead, and Morrison was ready. Earth would never give up. Not as long as he was alive to fight for it. The final push the Defiance limped through space, its hull battered and its engines barely functional after the desperate strike against the Zayler fleet. The ship's status was critical systems were failing, the crew was exhausted, and the enemy was closing in. Yet Captain Jake Morrison stood resolute, staring out into the vast void as Earth's last hope rested on their shoulders. The Zayler fleet was not easily deterred. They had regrouped quickly after the devastating strike, and now they were coming for Earth with a vengeance. But Morrison knew that humanity's survival depended on one final push-one last stand against the invaders that had threatened to destroy everything. Captain, the Zayler are advancing again, the sensor officer reported, her voice strained. They're preparing to launch another assault. They won't give us a break. Morrison's eyes hardened. They couldn't afford to retreat not. Now, not after everything they had fought for. Earth had sent 9,900 ships to invade, and only 17 had survived. But those 17 ships had shown the galaxy that humanity had the will to fight, even when the odds were stacked against them. We're not running, Morrison said, his voice cold with determination. We've taken a hit, but we're not done yet. We've got one chance to end this. The crew nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They knew that if they failed now, the Zayler would have free rein to finish their invasion. Earth would fall. But if they could defeat this wave, they might have a chance to buy Earth some time to regroup and mount a defense. Prepare the Defiance for its final push, Morrison ordered. We have to hit them where it hurts. I want every weapon we've got. All power to the engines. We're going in full force. As the crew scrambled to ready the ship for the last fight, Morrison sat in his command chair, watching the Zaylar fleet advance. They were massive, their ships lined up in a nearly impenetrable formation. But Morrison had learned one thing in the past weeks. The Zaylar were predictable. They didn't expect the unexpected. "Captain," the tactical officer called out, "we've identified a weak point in their formation. If we can get close enough, we can disable their flagship and take down their entire fleet." Morrison's mind worked quickly. They were going to have to get too close, but that was their only shot. The Defiance had enough power for one more strike, and it had to count. "Set course for their flagship." "Full speed ahead," Morrison commanded. "We'll take them out from the inside. Stay tight, stay focused, and don't give them a chance to react." The Defiance surged forward, its engines roaring as the crew braced for the final push. The Zaylar fleet loomed ahead, their ships, like dark shadows in the emptiness of space. But the Defiance wasn't backing down. It wasn't going to let Earth fall. As they closed the distance, the Defiance's weapons powered up. They had no time for finesse. This had to be an all-out attack. Morrison's eyes locked onto the lead Zaylar flagship, its colossal form looming in the distance. "Lock onto their shields," Morrison ordered. "Target the weakest points." The crew worked quickly, locking onto the flagship's defensive systems. The Defiance moved in, weaving between enemy ships, staying close to avoid the Zaylars. Firepower. Their targeting systems locked onto the flagship's shield generators, and Morrison gave the order. "Fire!" The Defiance's cannons roared to life, sending a barrage of energy blasts straight at the flagship's shield generators. The enemy shields flickered, weakening under the assault. The Defiance didn't stop. It fired again, and this time, the flagship's shields collapsed, leaving the ship vulnerable. "Hit them with everything," Morrison shouted. The Defiance's remaining firepower was unleashed in a final, massive strike. The energy beams tore through the flagship's hull, cutting through its defenses and causing massive explosions. The flagship lurched, smoke billowing from its shattered structure. The Zaylar fleet began to fall into chaos as their leadership was incapacitated. "Direct hit, Captain." "The flagship's down," the tactical officer cheered. Morrison's heart raced, but there was no time to celebrate. The Zaylar fleet was still in motion, still fighting to regroup. The Defiance had taken down their leadership, but the battle was far from over. "Reconfigure the weapons," Morrison ordered. "We need to keep them on the back foot. Don't give them a chance to recover." The crew worked quickly, adjusting the ship's systems to continue the assault. The Defiance's engines roared as it moved back into the fray. The enemy ships were scattered, their formations broken, but they were still dangerous. The Zaylar retaliated, launching a barrage of energy fire toward the Defiance. The ship shook violently as hits landed, but the crew held their ground. The Defiance fired back, taking down one enemy ship after another, but it was clear they couldn't keep this up for long. The Defiance was severely damaged, and the reinforcements from Earth were still hours away. "Captain," the communications officer said, urgency in her voice, "Earth's fleet is still en route, but they've encountered resistance. They won't arrive in time to help us directly." Morrison nodded. They were alone in this fight. Earth had sent reinforcements, but it would be up to the Defiance and its crew to hold the line until then. "Then we make sure they know who's still standing," Morrison said, determination in his eyes. "We fight until the very end." With the flagship destroyed and their fleet in disarray, the Zaylar were starting to retreat. They were regrouping, but they were losing their coordination. Earth had struck a decisive blow, but Morrison knew the war was far from over. The Zaylar would not give up so easily. Earth would have to stay vigilant. This was only one victory in a much longer battle for survival. As the Defiance fired its final shots into the retreating Zayler ships, Morrison allowed himself a moment of hope. Humanity had shown that it wasn't finished. And no matter how many ships the Zayler sent, humanity would never stop fighting. The final push had worked. Earth had delivered its message to the galaxy. They were not to be underestimated. The fight for Earth was still raging, but humanity had proven that they would not go down without a fight.